Welcome to this explainer. We generally think of mountains and forests as these massive permanent fixtures of our world. I mean, they're mountains, right? They aren't going anywhere. But in the eyes of the law, a landscape is really only as permanent as its legal definition. Today, we're going to explore how human words dictate the survival of our most ancient ecosystems. We'll see how the simple stroke of a pen and the exact vocabulary we use to categorize nature can literally wipe a mountain off the map or save a rainforest from the bulldozers. So let's kick things off with a deceptively simple question. Think about it for a second. What actually makes a hill a hill? Is it the height? The shape? And what makes a forest a forest? Is it how close together the trees are? Or is it just a line drawn on some government map somewhere? Now, you might be thinking, well, that's just semantics. But the answers to these questions aren't just academic. They are the literal battlegrounds for massive environmental and economic clashes that decide the fate of multi-million-dollar mining operations. Here is our roadmap for today. First up, defining nature by law. Second, the Aravalli Hills dilemma. Third, the Meghalaya forest dispute. Fourth, balancing economy and ecology. And finally, the path forward. Let's get right into it. Starting off with Section 1, defining nature by law, and the high legal stakes of geography. It is wild to think about, but a basic legal definition can mean the absolute difference between a strictly protected sanctuary and a highly active mining zone. If a piece of land is officially defined as a forest or a hill, it instantly triggers this massive shield of federal protections. Suddenly, companies have to jump through incredibly rigorous, time-consuming hurdles if they want to extract resources like limestone or granite. But if that exact same piece of land falls just 1 inch short of the legal definition, well, it can be legally cleared, heavily mined, and completely altered forever. Let's move right into Section 2, the Aravalli Hills dilemma, looking at a 2,000 million-year-old mountain range. To understand what's at stake, you have to realize just how old these mountains are. The Aravallis were formed 2,000 million years ago, during the Precambrian era. We're talking way before the Himalayas even existed. Today, they're these highly eroded remnants of a prehistoric mountain system, and over the decades, they've been hit hard by severe deforestation and intense mining pressure. Now, the government tried to step in with mining restrictions back in the 90s, but massive non-compliance eventually forced the Supreme Court to just drop a blanket ban in 2009. But here's the crazy part. The core issue never went away. No one could universally agree on what exactly counted as the Aravalli Hills across different states. And that brings us to 2025. To finally regulate the chaos, the Supreme Court adopted this incredibly specific, strict 100-meter rule. Under this definition, if a landform rises 100 meters or more above the local relief, boom, it's an Aravalli Hill. It gets protection, and so do its supporting slopes. Furthermore, if clusters of these hills are within 500 meters of each other, they are collectively protected as a range. The whole goal here was to bring absolute, undeniable scientific clarity to the situation. Now, as you might guess, people are completely split on whether this definition actually helps. Impartially speaking, the government sees this new definition as a massive win. They argue it finally provides much-needed clarity, strictly bans mining in the core areas, and lets them focus their resources on curbing illegal mining with things like drones and surveillance. But on the flip side, environmental critics look at the exact same ruling and see a total disaster. Why? Because an internal assessment showed that a strict 100-meter threshold actually excludes over 90% of the Aravalli system. Critics argue that mountains are continuous, interconnected ecological systems, not just the tallest peaks. By stripping protections from the lower foothills and valleys, they warn we're risking the destruction of crucial groundwater recharge zones, which could literally allow the Thar Desert to advance eastward into fertile plains. And we are talking about a massive scale here. Wrap your head around this number, 1.1 million. That represents the hectares of degraded land the Aravalli Green Wall Initiative is aiming to restore by 2027. Inspired by Africa's Great Green Wall, this is an ambitious 1,400-kilometer-long green belt designed to reverse land degradation and stop these brutal dust storms from suffocating the Delhi NCR region. But the catch? The success of this massive green wall depends almost entirely on whether the hills it relies on are legally protected from mining in the first place. Let's shift gears to Section 3, the Meghalaya forest disputes and the fascinating Lafarge cement case.
At the absolute heart of this next conflict is something geologists call karst topography. Now, the mining site for a massive cross-border cement project by Lafarge sat right on this incredibly rugged terrain. It's an area completely full of fractured rocks, deep caverns, caves, cracks, and it has almost no topsoil. Because it's so incredibly rocky, it absolutely does not look like your traditional picturesque image of a lush, dense forest. And that visual deception right there, that became the epicenter of a decade-long legal war.
The question was it just a rocky wasteland or a rapidly vanishing rainforest? Back in the late 90s, early project reports and local councils looked at the site and basically wrote it off as a barren wasteland, completely devoid of any real forest land. Based entirely on that definition, the project was granted environmental clearance to mine limestone and ship it right across the border to Bangladesh using a massive 7.2-kilometer conveyor belt. But years later, in 2006, the chief conservator of forests actually visited the site and was completely stunned. He found the mining lease surrounded by thick natural vegetation, towering trees, and what experts actually categorized as a virgin tropical semi-evergreen forest. And that simple issue of mislabeling led to a staggering consequence: 9,345. That is the total number of trees caught up in the felling for the Meghalaya mining project once the real ecosystem was finally assessed. The project proponents defended themselves, arguing they had relied completely on official certificates stating the area wasn't a forest. But the reality on the ground was that thousands of trees were being cleared without the proper forest diversion clearances, all because those early definitions focused solely on the rocky karst floor and completely ignored the surrounding ecological canopy. So how does something like that happen? Well, it was a wildly complex regulatory journey. As we covered, from 1999 to 2001, initial clearances were handed out based entirely on the no forest assumption. Then came the 2006 discovery, which prompted the Supreme Court to slam the brakes and completely halt all non-forestry activities. It was a massive shock to the system. The project was essentially treated as a fait accompli, a done deal that had operated illegally, even if it was inadvertent. Finally, in 2010, after comprehensive ecological studies, massive penalties, mandatory payments for compensatory afforestation, and a newly mapped scientific understanding of the landscape, an ex post facto, or retroactive, forest clearance was granted, letting mining resume, but under incredibly strict conditions. Which brings us to Section 4, Balancing Economy and Ecology. Truly, the ultimate tightrope walk. You see, it's really easy to judge from the outside, but these decisions are never just black and white. Take the Meghalaya situation. The local village Dubar actually wanted to lease this land. Unorganized, unscientific mining was already happening there anyway, so bringing in a major corporation brought massive revenue, brand new healthcare facilities, schools, and solid jobs to the tribal population. But the ecological costs on the other side of the ledger are just as real. You're looking at the severe deforestation of tropical moist forests, the irreversible destruction of ancient natural limestone caverns, and, jumping back to the Aravallis, the very real worsening of air pollution for millions of people. It's a genuine, high-stakes balancing act. But when we're walking that tightrope, we have to look back at foundational policies, like this one from India's 1988 National Forest Policy. It explicitly states that environmental stability absolutely must come first. You can't simply trade a rainforest for a cement plant, no matter how high the profit margins are, because the long-term cost of losing your water supply, or literally inviting the desert into your farmlands, bankrupts everyone in the end. And that leads us right into Section 5, the path forward, how we go about securing our fragile landscapes. So what's the actual blueprint here? Drawing straight from the cases we've just explored, it comes down to a few very specific strategies to protect areas like the Aravallis and Meghalaya. First, we desperately need comprehensive, standardized scientific mapping. We can't rely on vague visual descriptions anymore. We need hard data on exactly where the hills end and the valleys begin. Second, we've got to lean into modern tech, using drones and satellite imagery to aggressively enforce bans on illegal mining before a landscape is cleared. Third, we actually have to look backward to move forward, utilizing indigenous watershed management systems, things like traditional tankas and jalaras, to restore degraded forests. And lastly, we need to actively stabilize sand dunes with surface vegetation to control wind erosion and stop the desert from expanding.
I want to leave you with this final thought for today's explainer. Who ultimately gets to define nature, and what price are we willing to pay when those definitions inevitably fall short? Whether we are talking about a strict 100-meter threshold in the Aravallis or the complicated definition of karst topography in Meghalaya, the literal words we write into our laws shape the physical world around us. Balancing our undeniable need for mineral extraction with the absolute security of our fragile ecosystems is the defining challenge of our era. It requires honest reporting, deep respect for indigenous communities, and an unwavering commitment to the environments that keep us all alive. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning how we define the world around us.